Good evening, family and friends, snakes, apes, and whoever else may attend. So it's your sister Shaya back with another late night episode of Story Time. Continuing with the book The Great Cosmic Mother Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth. We are on the chapter of the moon and womb. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like to purchase the book, it is in the description. The ancient people believed, with their usual biological accuracy, that the moon mother created human society. If the moon were to vanish, all mental activity on earth would cease. In their languages, words for wisdom, knowledge, spirit, soul, and time are always cognate with words for the moon. In Dakotan, Wakan means spiritual, wonderful, and menstrual. Names for the goddess usually have their roots in words for womb and vulva. The original magic was always the woman's and was associated with a change of power or energy field at the time of the menstrual period. The most ancient moon cults were menstrual cults. Menstrual blood is liquid flesh, both sacred and biological or magically powerful. Within it dwells the life spirit. So the ancients painted their dead and their womb like underground burial chambers with red ochre, the color of rebirth within the mother. The human womb is strongly supplied with conscious sensory nerves. It is a sense organ complex, thin walled, and raw like a womb. In second stage childbirth, it has a powerful 100-pound thrust. At menstruation, the inner skin is shed, and this was once seen to be similar to the shedding of the snake's skin and the eternal renewal of the moon out of herself. Women who were in especially strong resonance with the moon mind became shamans, oracular priestesses, witches. They were chosen by their group or were self chosen for their special psychic powers and divinations of the blood at their menstruation brings each month to women. I'm sorry. Their special psychic powers and divinations of the blood at their first menstruation. Shamanism, an ecstatic lunar technology, relies on the natural psychic descent into body consciousness that menstruation brings each month to women. Shamanistic states of possession are still practiced among North Pole Inuits, Native Americans, Siberians, the Sames of Lapland, and pagan people everywhere trying to revive the techniques. Shamanic possession and all ecstatic trances and hysteric states. Hysteria means womb. Hystera, womb consciousness. And hysteria is a hypersensitive state during which occult or transnatural phenomena occur. The apparent suspension of physical laws, as in firewalking, cuts that do not bleed, stigmata, suspended breathing, levitation, flying objects, etc. The suspension of physical law is apparent because in reality, such phenomena occur within physical law, insofar as it can be manipulated or bent by a mind with the proper techniques. A part of this technique is a talent for ecstatic trance, in which very strange things happen and happen for all to see. In our society, this is called madness. In more sophisticated cultures, it was recognized as a fascinating skill. In any case, shamanic hysteria is a female womb state, just as the Delphic oracle and her python were named. Menstrual rites and taboos. The first measure of time was menstrual time, and from this, women developed lunar cycles and ancient astrology. Colleges of women, moon colleges of Hera, womb giver of laws, were able to influence conception and birth through dream control. Communion with the body through dreams gave the self knowledge through the cycle. It is possible to have dream knowledge of conception, of pregnancy, before any physical signs appear. In the experience of one of the authors, within 2 to 3 days after intercourse, the body tells one in a dream that conception has occurred, along with the correct future sex of the fetus. It happened 3 out of 3 times. All this is chemical information which our brains, as electrochemical information centers, have access to. Translating chemical information into consciousness via dreams is a matter of receptivity and technique, a technique ancient women surely practiced because it works. In The Wise Wound, Shuttle and Redgrove speculate that primal women might even have learned to menstruate from the new moon or dark moon. Further, that perhaps they used drugs that were not only mind expanders but also contained steroid substances related to the human sex hormone, a steroid that could abort the uterine lining, this giving women great sexual sensitivity and also independence from unwanted reproduction and from men. We do feel the lunar tides in our bodies, and the water in our bodies sees the moon as the crystalline structures of water alter or resonate with the moon passing overhead. Women unconditioned by pejorative patriarchal taboos against the menstrual cycle were surely in fine tune with all its phases. They knew in their bodies and dreams the possibilities of the moon. To know something is to be it. We neglect her rights at our cost. We no longer contain our cycle. Under patriarchy, we are chained to it in fear, shame, annoyance, and under constant threat of unwanted pregnancy. Under patriarchy, menstruation is a punishment rather than a gift, an advantage, and a talent. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and other father god religions trace the evil of women to menstruation. Menstruation is the visible bloody sign of the serpent, of the devil in the female body. Patriarchal ontology states that all evil flows from this original female evil, moon blood. Menstruation was seen by biblical men as the curse of God laid upon woman for her sin in Eden, and the quote unquote curse it is called even today. The European Inquisition probed into women's blood cycle, dream life, and trance experiences, declaring that any woman possessed by a pythonic or oracular menstrual spirit must burn. This idea also originates in the Bible. The Old Testament patriarchs quite intentionally set themselves against the lunar psyche in women and in men who are half female, in their desire to destroy the goddess religion and the goddess within us all. Because of this, the menstruating womb became the devil of patriarchy. The only good woman is a pregnant woman, etc. And the 300 plus years of European Christian witch hunting has been accurately called 9 million menstrual murders. Women were burned for practicing our natural moon crafts of midwifery, hypnotism, healing, dowsing, herbal and drug use, dream study, and sexual pleasure. Crafts that go back to the Stone Age and were passed down from mother to daughter for over 50,000 years. Since this persecution, European women at least have suffered an extreme non alignment with their internal lunar processes. European and American women, however hard we try, rarely get back in touch with the lunar chemical information because we live in isolation from each other and the moon, in an environment hostile to the moon as anything but a rocket launch base or a gigantic neon billboard in the sky. Men in patriarchal societies learn or reveal a great jealousy and fear of natural women, of the sexual, mental, and spiritual abilities of fully evolved women living in harmony with the consciousness of our own bodies. The menstrual taboo is the consequence of this fear and resentment as they are projected back on women's lives. Under patriarchy, all life is dualized. Women also are dichotomized, cut in two. There is the good little ovulating wife who is supposed to be passive and not very sexual. It's hard for even a woman to feel sexy cleaning the toilet. And then there is the quote unquote witch, the sex fiend, whore, scarlet woman. Red again of active, dynamic, menstrual sexuality. As both female cycles and the wise wound show, there are two poles to women's sexuality: the pole of ovulation, which tends to express itself in terms of wanting to surrender. Its white, clear discharge is called the river of life, and it is acceptable in patriarchy because it is receptive and fertile. And the pole of menstruation, before, during, and after, which expresses itself in wanting to take erotic initiative to capture and demand. The red flow is called the quote unquote river of death, and its multi orgasmic and aggressive sexuality is taboo in patriarchy. Our menstrual sexuality, which is non fertile, is called quote unquote masculine and castrating by Freudian types who share in the cultural fear of mature women. In early patriarchy and in some contemporary indigenous cultures that have been colonized by misogynist religions, the menstrual taboo is openly punitive. It codifies sexual hostility in societies where women are treated as currency in men's affairs. Under the menstrual taboos, women were to be punished for our powers: sexual, reproductive, and psychic powers. We were banished to the menstrual hut, called unclean and dangerous to the man and his laws and his gods. In some tribal communities, we were imprisoned in dark cages or rooms for months, for as long as 3 years with the first menstruation. In American Indian cultures, on the other hand, the menstruating woman is seen for what she is: a powerful life source. As Daughters of Copper Woman shows us, Native American women have worked to keep alive for generations their affirmative and celebratory customs surrounding female puberty, including years of physical training to make women strong in both body and mind. They did this despite constant opposition from Christian missionaries and preachers who always view women's blood customs as quote unquote savage and satanic. Underneath the colonializing misogyny of Christianity and Islam, Black African women too have managed to keep alive ancient puberty and menstrual customs, which are energizing for women. Worldwide, much of women's sacred blood rights and magical instruments have simply been stolen by patriarchy, or if not co-opted, repressed. Male initiation rites can express an envy and awe of women as men cut or wound their penises in imitation of bleeding vaginas. These rites reenact birth and menstruation, but they also symbolize a violent separation from women, earth, and the maternal, more a guilty theft than a true participation. As Margaret Mead and others have shown, the more warlike and authoritarian a society is, the stronger is its menstrual taboo. In such societies, a paranoid emphasis is placed on women's quote unquote corrupting and debilitating influence, and men's need to overpower, dominate, and devalue her. Male training in aggression is linked with taboos for both men and boys against any knowledge of or contact with women's natural functions. It would seem that when there is no acknowledgement of women's bleeding, then there is instead a male acting out of ritual and violent bloodshed in war. Warlike, aggressive male societies are in rivalry with women over which sex sheds the most sacred blood. War is men's response to women's ability to give birth and menstruate. All three are blood shedding rituals. Women's blood rites give life, however, while men's bloody rituals give only death. To compensate for this, such authoritarian societies culturally repress and degrade women's blood functions, while elevating murderous war to a holy act. The women's menstrual mysteries of inspiration become in war god worshiping patriarchy the mysteries of resisted knowledge, repression, madness. Patriarchal societies are founded upon a crime. This crime is not the murder of the father, as Freud would have us believe. It is the rape and scorn of the mother. This is the unconscious horror that each girl child inherits, and unlike male castration anxiety, rape anxiety is all too often reinforced by the daily reality of the act and threat of rape. Men's so-called fear of castration is simply a fear of losing command over women in patriarchal society, which equates domination of women with manhood. If Western males have any legitimate fear of castration, it derives from the act of circumcision, which is a terrible thing to inflict on a male infant. But this custom comes from the Father God of the Bible. It doesn't come from women or any great mother religion. Living constantly under the steel roof of patriarchy's criminal misogyny, women are forced to bend to and accept on pain of ever reverberating punishment and terror, men's paranoid projections. Women, as long as we fear punishment for our powers, and as long as we are economically dependent on men, must accept that our bodies are unclean and deficient. Under patriarchy, the mother is feared and hated, quite crazily, both for her power and her weakness. Everything a man cannot courageously accept about himself is projected onto his mother or his wife, or onto any random woman walking down the street. Until yesterday, women were policed by the professionals, also gynecologists and psychiatrists, who acted as cultural reinforcers of the rules of quote unquote femininity, who blamed our ills like menstrual depression and pain on our failure to be feminine. How many men have grown rich being in the business of telling women what we are supposed to be? Obviously, patriarchy wants us to be something that is not natural for us. Otherwise, we wouldn't become crazy and sick trying to achieve it. Until yesterday, once a month witches were given drugs and electroshock treatment by the modern Inquisition, members of these psychotherapeutic professions. Now, thanks to feminism and more women doctors, menstrual depression and pain, including the premenstrual syndrome, are being seriously studied and treated with intelligence and concern, not the traditional contempt. But we can't forget how many women just yesterday were thrown into psychiatric wards by husbands and physicians because our cultural menstrual taboos rendered everyone stupid about basic life functions. Women must understand that the object of taboo is also the object of strong desire. Menstrual blood is a powerful sexual element, and ancient men responded to women's rhythms. But to unyielding patriarchal man whose entire self-concept depends on the fact that he is not a woman, any primal response to women's blood and rhythms is frightening. He fears to lose control. He fears loss of his ego. He fears empathizing with a woman. He fears melting into the other in the sexual act. He has a lot of fears. And so the heterosexual act inevitably becomes a reaction to fear. It becomes violation and rape. To repress his fears, he takes on military terminology. He sees himself invading the woman's body. She becomes his sexual victim, his prisoner of war. Simply because she had sex with him, engaged in battle, allowed herself to be invaded. He must treat her with contempt as he would treat any loser. Few men in patriarchy are perceptive enough to realize that they have themselves lost a great deal, including the pleasures of sex. Men have mutilated their own sexuality along with trying to mutilate women's. Ejaculation is not necessarily the same as orgasm. Reich was trying to investigate the difference between a genital reflex and a total mind-body response. Ancient Taoist and tantric teachings, originating in Chinese and Indian matriarchies, taught men sexual techniques that suited women. Ancient women had strong genital pride and knowledge, and in no way envied, feared, or imitated men. Women were the initiators of sexual knowledge. Women's collectives, no doubt at the time of their menstrual flows, withdrew from the men to meditate, to practice lesbian love, to commune with the goddess in body prayer. For women, there is no separation between sex and spirit. Patriarchy exists by demanding that sex and spirit be opposites and then repressing and punishing women for contradicting such a fiat. Even in the menstrual huts, a custom enforced and twisted by patriarchy, women could still gather together to confirm their own identity, to sing and tell stories. At least they knew that their menstrual uncleanness was a misogynistic taboo. But in female cycles, Paula Weidiger makes it very clear that in the modern Western world, because there are no outward ritual signs of the menstrual taboo, it is even more insidious and harmful to us women. At her first menstruation, the young modern girl is abandoned by her culture. She is made to feel that her body and its rhythms are a biological impediment to freedom and fun. The subliminal message she receives from her culture is that a properly functioning body is male and non-cyclic. On the job, at school, also, work is defined as a male activity. If she wants to be equal at work, she must function like a male or non-cyclically. All legal and cultural disputes about women being pregnant or nursing at work or nursing in public derive from the fact that all workspace, all public space in the West is defined in terms of the non-cyclic male body. Women cannot enter the workforce or enter public life unless they agree to act though their bodies were functionally male also. To act as though one could function like a male is to suppress the fact that one is actually female. The menstrual hut is no longer to one side of the village. It is now constructed in women's own hearts and minds as a very secret place where we take care of all our female functions while trying to act as though they weren't happening. When it comes to menstruation, we are female in secret, posing as male in public. In fact, with the popularity of panty shields, the entire cycle from ovulation discharge to menstrual blood can now be kept so, quote unquote, discreet or hidden that any woman can become vice president of IBM. In our secret hearts and minds, though, which are our menstrual huts, continues a very real fear of men's, the male world, the world as a possession of men, negative and punitive responses to menstruation, to our whole female cycle. Female sex objects abound, but they are all man-made. When is the last time you saw a centerfold with hairy armpits, hairy legs, and a blood flow? The young girl of the modern West learns from all these subliminal signals to distrust dislike, and be ashamed of her own body and feelings and those of other women. The femaleness she knows, body hair, sweat, monthly blood flow, menstrual odor, ovulation, discharge, must be hidden, taken care of in secret, while the femaleness men want to see, their own, must be enhanced, publicly flaunted. Whether she really feels like doing this or not, she sees all the other women doing it. The message is that she must depend on something outside herself, men or male taste, for her self definition. And she is on her own, isolated. The modern community of women exists only to show her how to hide her femaleness. She comes crazily or with resignation to associate menstruation with hurts, wounds, body waste, disabilities, shame, curtailment of her freedom. She comes to believe her lack of freedom comes from nature, her own biology, rather than resulting directly from patriarchal oppression and male fear. And so the menstrual taboo has been one of the most successful methods devised by men to undermine self acceptance, self understanding, and self confidence in women. It acts as a constant confirmation of a negative self image. Most complaints about the advertisement of personal products on television come from women. Unfortunately, their complaints are not directed at the commercial exploitation of women's bodies by male industries. No, women complain such ads are in bad taste. They do not want their shame, their secret femaleness discussed in public. Those ads belong in the menstrual hut. Only dependent motherhood is celebrated and recognized as legitimate in patriarchy. And sexuality is presented as reproduction or naughty sin rather than as profound emotional experience. Sexual passion is not seen as an attribute to femininity. The only way our culture can handle women's sexuality is in pornography, a male distortion that reveals patriarchal puritanism and fearful fastidiousness like a funhouse mirror reveals your face. Women who cannot or will not accept the taboos are still punished, as we've been punished for 2,000 years in the patriarchal world, as lesbians, unmarried mothers. Why do they get people? Anyway, unmarried mothers, thinkers, artists, witches. One form of punishment is culturally mandated rape, which is clearly increasing as women struggle for freedom. The message is clear: only when we women give up our sexual autonomy and our right to be independent and creative, only when we give up ourselves and accept patriarchal male definitions of femininity as passive, negative, and receptive, only then will we be treated humanely. Only then will we be treated with patronizing smiles and door openings as something just a little less than the male. It is male fear, hatred, and envy that has for so long tried to turn our female abilities into incapacities. And despite all suave veneer of advanced Western culture, it is gut level male fear, hatred, and envy that women must fight to reverse this field. Both Female Cycles and The Wise Wound speak at great length about the menstrual epidemic among modern civilized women. As much as 90% of all women suffer from some form of distress, pain, cramps, depression in connection with menstruation. Severe cramping is now being treated with prostaglandins. Some depression is related to menstrual edema, but depression is also anger turned inwards or knowledge withheld. When violence is done to our nature, it talks back in irregular and disharmonious ways. The attempts at detaching oneself from it simply lead to the body language of illness. When we menstruate, we are more psychologically open and vulnerable, and because of this, more unable to accept injustices, deceits, and distortions. And so our stored up rage and sexual frustrations are likely to burst out at this time. Penelope Shuttle claims that painful bleeding, backache, and cramps can be relieved by orgasmic experience. But because of the menstrual taboo and men's fear of women's blood, most heterosexual women are not able to live out their heightened and powerful menstrual sexuality. I gotta chime in here. If you change your diet, you won't have cramps. Uh, the menstrual cycle deeply links body, soul, and mind, but traditionally, male doctors have viewed women as hormone robots. They have a hard time conceiving us as souls or minds. The menstrual tension is also caused by an increased need to dream and to meditate. This was the time, remember, when ancient women experienced prophetic dreams and went into trance states. This is the monthly transformation and rebirth of the ego self. The wise wound talks of children's awareness of the mother's menstrual clock. The breath and taste of blood is our first experience at birth, and we can smell our mother's blood each month. We are aware of her unhappiness and frustration. Our children are aware of ours. Men also are influenced from childhood by their mother's cycles. If menstruation were not a taboo but an open primary life experience for all people, we could all deal with it. Long overdue is research into male behavior and sexual attitudes to menstruation, menopause as well. It does no good to educate girls and boys about the clinical aspects of puberty, menstruation, sex, and reproduction while never tackling the psychological, cultural, and religious attitudes that make these natural experiences into such a problem for everyone. The very religions that have turned human sexuality into pathology and nightmare should not be allowed to determine how public school children learn about sex. Most of our American misogyny, especially ideas about menstrual uncleanness, comes from the Bible. For this reason alone, the Bible should be kept from public schools as a major source of the cultural defamation of women. Surely the First Amendment should protect young girls from being told God made them to be unclean and in need of monthly purification. More study needs to be done also on the effects of the birth control pills and IUDs on premenstrual symptoms and on cyclic experience in general. It has been assumed that women will tolerate any menstrual upheaval in exchange for effective contraception, and in the short run, this might be true. We have yet to see the long term effects of reproductive technology on women's whole being, mind, body, and soul. Menopause is the end of the menstrual cycle. In patriarchal culture, it is also treated as the end of a woman's sexual identity. This reveals how totally female sexuality is equated with reproduction in the patriarchal primate brain and in opposition to the facts of female evolution. The menopausal woman is portrayed almost exclusively in Western culture as a sad, ridiculous, and powerless creature. This is not so in many other cultures, including Native American, Hindu, African, where the older woman is accorded great respect and actually comes into her own in middle age, enjoying maximum freedom, independence, authority, and community influence after her childbearing years are over. With feminism, European and American postmenopausal women are also enjoying a renaissance of sorts, starting new occupations, returning to school, traveling, and experimenting with non traditional lifestyles. Whether the reawakening and enjoyment of new powers extends to her sex life, however, the contradiction in our culture is that women are seen by men as sexually attractive when young and fertile, precisely during the years when we are menstruating, and also seen as sexually dangerous. Women must, however, not show any disturbing signs of that menstruation or cyclicity. We are taught that we are our reproductive functions and that we are valuable only as long as we can reproduce. All the suppressed fear and envy of women that men feel for us during our fertile years is let loose in the form of male mockery and outright hatred of older women. Men of middle age, on the contrary, are often at the peak of their professional, economic, and cultural powers. Sexually, they are much less empowered than middle aged women, and often they attempt to mask this by becoming even more insufferably egotistical and dominant. Or with their cultural and economic empowerment, they buy younger women or a younger wife. It is not that the postmenopausal woman has become less sexual, the opposite is true, but that men lose their sexual interest in her. One reason being that male sexuality is still primate sexuality, and primate sexuality is obsessively reproductive. Dominating fertile females is the badge of macho primatehood. Traditionally, older women have ended up pretending they have no sexuality. They have become sexually invisible or culturally sexless. Recently, also with feminism and the discovery that older women can be very interesting people, it has become trendy, if not always acceptable on Main Street, for older women to be coupled with younger men. This is a very ancient pagan situation and good for us. Another option is, anyway, with current life expectancy, the average woman in the West has about 25 sexually active years in front of her after the decay of the ovaries and the ending of the fertility cycle. Women and society must adjust to this. We cannot go back to spending 1/4 of our lives, perhaps the sexiest time of our lives, as sexual zombies. Our culture, if it is to be ours, will also have to begin adjusting, responding positively to women's monthly rhythms and sexual and emotional changes. The whole range of female being and potential. For this to happen, of course, we women must utterly transform life and society to be able once again to tune into the goddess within us. Such a transformation will have to be genuinely bloody. It must affirm women's blood. The original woman, witch, rebel, midwife, and healer. What would it have been like if patriarchy had never happened? To get an idea, we have to comprehend the first law of matriarchy. Women control our own bodies. This would seem a basic premise of any fully evolved human culture, which is why primate patriarchy is based on its denial. Children were generally welcome in matrifocal society as there was enough food for all, and children could help in agricultural and craft work. When childbearing is not a punishment but self chosen, and when raising children is not an economic survival disaster, most of us enjoy being around children. Most men do too. In pre-patriarchal cultures, children were raised communally, not closed up within four nuclear walls, not as property, but as the fruit of all. Most of all, childbearing and child raising were a part of each woman's life, a nourishing as well as nurturing part, but not her whole life. When women control our bodies, our daily lives, our environment, and our goals, we don't inflict on ourselves the terrible split between motherhood and self-realization that patriarchy and the nuclear family inflict on us. This split is a structural one indigenous to male-dominated environments. In matriarchy, women could be mothers and also enjoy other energies and interests. men who envied women or our capacity to bear children and also do other things turned around and invented patriarchy, in which motherhood is structured as an all-consuming burden. Men knew they could never bear children, but they could try to keep us from doing anything else. But women don't always want children for a multitude of reasons best determined by women. So in matristic cultures, there were a number of magic rites and techniques in use that contributed to fertility control. Women always had knowledge of herbal contraceptives and abortifacs, as well as narcotics and muscle relaxants. The best the best medicine for not getting pregnant is not having sex. Okay, so women always had knowledge of herbal contraceptives and abortifacs, as well as narcotics and muscle relaxants, like raspberry tea that could ease childbirth. When women are in natural control of our own fertility, population is always kept in practical relation to the needs of the group and the abundance of the environment. That, after all, is what it's all about. Since time immemorial, since the beginning of human time, the arts of gynecology, midwifery, and holistic herbal healing, including birth control, were wholly female domains, guarded by the Neanderthal women, the Cro-Magnon women, the Neolithic women, and priestesses of the great goddess. Contraception and abortion can become illegal only when in patriarchal class society, church and state define it so for their own purposes. And what are their purposes? Large populations that drive the wages and value of labor down, masses of people kept in ignorance and wretchedness, out of which come male cannon fodder and male and female prostitutes and broodmares to service their wars. Patriarchy is based on cynical male control of female reproduction, and the resultant ugliness of such a culture is there for all to see. When women practice their own medicine, thus controlling their own bodies, such a state could not come into existence. One of the major weapons of patriarchy was the establishment of a clothed male medical profession that barred women from practicing their ancient herbal medicine and gynecological skills. In medieval Europe, this elite male medical profession was the joint creation of the royal courts and the Christian church, which joined together to create the European court state as the political machinery to break the power of the people on the land, the peasants, the pagans, the people of the witches. Because women value the quality of life experienced by their children, women throughout history have done what they could do to keep population in balance with environment. Herbal and mechanical contraception is one method. Abortion has been another. Tribal women throughout the world nursed their babies for 4 years, and during this time might have no sexual relations with a man, using such means to space out children. Tribal women averaged 4 children in their reproductive lifetimes, each child receiving the maximum of intense maternal, physical, and emotional care during the critical early years. No method is ideal, some are extreme. But when contraception and abortion are not practiced, the results are even more extreme: infanticide, malnutrition, infant starvation deaths, and mass famine. No woman making her own choices would deliberately bear children only to see them starve to death. Among people practicing abortion, even infanticide, the spirit of the dead child was returned to the earth womb to await new birth. Partaking still in the substance of the Great Mother, it was not lost, but the well-being of the living group was maintained. Patriarchy arose among cattle breeders who had discovered the male role in conception. They believed that the entire life force was in male semen, and that the female womb served only as a vessel for the male seed. which was elevated into the Father God. So among Near Eastern Father God religions, the child had value only as proof of male potency, and only insofar as it had been given into his ideological power. Catholics and fundamentalist Protestants believe that children dying without baptism into their religions have no souls and no salvation. The unbaptized dead infants remain forever in limbo. In the past, Semitic, Jewish, or Muslim children who died without being named, circumcised, or otherwise ritually recognized by the fathers were buried or burnt without ceremony. These children had identity only as the father's property. Today, the Catholic Church maintains that humans, including fetuses, receive life entirely from God the Father. The 10 months of biological labor put into this child by the mother mean nothing. She is just a vessel. Pope Paul VI announced in 1972 that no woman has the right to abortion, even if her life depends on it, even if she has other children who might need her, even if she is a fully grown conscious human being who might desire to live. He was thereby claiming that the fetus, always considered potentially male, is more sacred than the human mother who bears it within her body. Why? She is only female, but the fetus comes from God, the big bull stud in the sky. In March 1984, a pregnant Irish woman in Dundalk died from a recurrence of cancer, surrounded by Catholic doctors who refused to give her any treatment for fear of damaging the fetus. At the time of her death, she had tumors on her legs, neck, and spine, but the doctors had refused to x-ray her, refused to give her any painkillers, refused all treatment absolutely. She died 2 days after delivering a premature baby who died at birth. Can we really believe that celibate priests care so much about the lives of infants? Or is it that their true concern is to maintain absolute control over the bodies of women, since it is upon this control that their entire religion is based? Feminists say if men could get pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament. Women must understand that because men cannot get pregnant, their next move is to establish patriarchal religion, whose major sacrament is to make childbearing a punishment. A punishment for sex, a punishment for being female. Certainly it was not so in the ancient matriarchies. The earliest recorded abortion recipes yet, oh, yeah. The earliest recorded abortion recipes yet found date from circa 2700 BC. They were inscribed on Egyptian papyrus scrolls. From Egypt come the first known medical texts also, and among them were prescriptions for contraceptive substances meant to be inserted into the vagina. This is where people is cursed right now. Very likely they knew of temporarily sterilizing herbal potions that women could take. After all, the hormone progesterone, now used in the birth control pills, exists naturally in various plants. Today's multi-billion-dollar birth control industry was originally built on 2 yam roots found in Mexico. The Talmudic Jews invented the vaginal sponge, which was in use soaked in oil until the invention of the Dutch cap by a woman doctor in Holland in the 1880s. Pessary means stone. Oriental farmers and travelers knew that if a small object like a stone was inserted into the womb of a female camel or other domestic animal, she would not conceive. Native healers on Java traditionally inserted a small object into the wombs of women for the same purposes. The original IUD. In ancient Rome and Greece, vinegar or lemon juice were used as acid spermicides, and 1/2 of a squeezed out lemon is a pretty good cap. Native American women knew plants and root concoctions to take for temporary sterility, for abortion, as well as childbirth ease. Native American women knew plants and root concoctions. I'm sorry. All African and worldwide Aboriginal people the same. It would seem that at no time in history have women been so totally oppressed in their sexuality, kept so ignorant of contraceptive methods, while forced into compulsory and yearly childbearing as in the so-called civilized societies of the Christian West. As Dr. Margaret Murray pointed out in the 1930s, modern ideas of the witch are based entirely on Inquisition trial records of the 16th to 18th centuries, when the European Christian church was totally mobilized to crush out the remains of Western paganism. The stereotype was eagerly reinforced by the European medical professions, who saw the witches, who were also herbal healers and midwives, as economic rivals. Before these wholesale purges and repressions, many of the great early European doctors of medicine and pharmacology, like Paracelsus, claimed openly that they had learned all they knew of healing and drugs directly from women's witchcraft. The Wiccan or wise women practiced the ancient Dianic religion and functioned as midwives and healers to the common people and the peasantry. Throughout the European countryside, the sage femme was called in at childbirth. These women were highly skilled. It is on record that some could perform cesarean sections with complete success for the mother and child. But during the late Middle Ages, dominated by the Christian Inquisition, the delivery of a pregnant woman was no longer considered a sacrament but a dirty business, and the women who attended the poor at childbirth were frequently considered social outcasts or worse. They were charged with witchcraft, tortured, and burned. One witch was burned alive in Scotland for the sole crime of bathing some neighborhood children for hygienic reasons in the midst of an epidemic. Healthcare and healing were publicly discouraged by the Christian church, which officially believed that life was supposed to be diseased, wretched, and painful. This was God's will as punishment for human sin. People who tried to alleviate suffering or cure illness, especially through ancient folk and herbal medicine or simple hygiene, were suspected to be agents of the devil. In Egypt, circa 3000 BC, both female and male priest doctors had helped women in childbirth. But in medieval Europe, midwifery was considered a crime for men and probably a sign of witchcraft for women. The witch hunts coincided with the rise of a specialist male medical profession and were instigated by celibate monks whose minds were inflamed with the most psychotic sexual hatred of women. During the early Renaissance, medicine claimed to be more scientific, a new male profession subject to government and professional control. Eventually, these male professionals discovered the gold mine of obstetrics. Even midwifery began to be surrounded by educational requirements from which women were excluded. Male midwives appeared in Europe, and doctors insisted on being consulted during childbirth. These were the same professional medics who later demanded that laboring women enter hospital wards and then moved from corpse autopsies to childbirth beds, spreading infection to women and causing higher mother mortality rates than had ever existed in pagan Europe. The modern male medical professions rose on the ashes of the burnt witches. These women were vilified in every way that clerical tongue or pen or torture instrument could inflict, and luridly accused of everything: of making men both lustful and impotent, of helping women in labor, and of depopulating Christendom by strangling newborn babies. In 1486, it was officially declared that no one does more harm to the Catholic faith than midwives. And there was truth in this accusation. European women living in wretched poverty and condemned to unending pregnancy by the church's celibate male priesthood had no greater friends than the sage femmes, the wise women midwives who told them how to prevent conception, what herbs to use for abortion, and how to ease labor pain. As the church rightly suspected, the midwives also often neglected to properly baptize the newborn into the Christian faith. All this gave women a certain autonomy and control over their own bodies, and this power threatened the power of the male priest, the father church, and father state. Midwives were witches, and witchcraft was high treason against God's noble male majesty. The Christian male hierarchy, both Catholic and Protestant, which was developing during this time, was intent on establishing total domination over the innermost thoughts of the European people. The Inquisition was the instrument of this domination. Witches were independent of mind, they were of the people, and they served the goddess, the native goddess of Neolithic Europe, not a male god imposed by Roman imperialism. Their covens were correctly suspected to be meeting places for revolutionary peasants. Joan of Arc was legendarily a member of a witch coven. In every small village or city neighborhood, the witch was the spiritual and political rival of the local priest and the imperial church. She offered real healing through anciently tested herbal knowledge, while the priest could only give slogans promising relief in heaven or punishment in hell. Medieval Christianity taught that this world was the devil's excrement, our flesh the home of original sin, and our lives an evil to be despised and endured. With the church's disruption of the old ways, human life in Europe was indeed becoming quite ugly. Countering this, the witch kept alive the ancient pagan nature wisdom and cyclic rhythms, dances, songs, beliefs, lore, and skills celebrating the sacredness of life and the ecstasy of earth. The people followed the witches, who always had better music and more delight. The Hebrew God Yahweh in Genesis 3:16 had condemned Eve for her disobedience. I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow shalt you bring forth children. And so, according to the church, it should be. To the male priesthood and celibate monks, woman alone was sexual. Her genitals were fearsome and unclean, and childbirth was disgusting and unholy. To Christian clerics, original sin adhered intrinsically to orgasmic experience, to the fact of female genitalia. Children were born dirty as a result of the dirt of sexual conception. Testament, on the other hand, comes from the Latin testes, testicle, or male witness. In Childbirth Without Fear, 1942, Dr. Grantley Dick declares that there can be no more horrible stigma upon our civilization than the history of childbirth. Long after anesthetics were medically available and as late as the mid-19th century, the clerical and medical authorities opposed any methods that might relieve women's suffering during labor. Women were meant to suffer greatly as God's punishment for our collective sin. Witches were accused and arrested and tortured and burned for the crime of helping women in labor with herbs and muscle relaxing techniques. Such womanly help was a dreadful and impious act against the will of God. And as Martin Luther, founder of Protestantism, stated, if a woman grows weary and at last dies from childbearing, it matters not. Let her die from bearing. She is there to do it. In ancient society and among primitive people still, laboring women sit in a squatting position, actively in charge of the body's creative work. In the modern West, until yesterday, the Christian tradition of passive suffering prevailed in the labor room. The woman lying on her back, usually strapped down in cruelly impersonal hospital environments, while a male doctor delivered her child. Woman bears the pain, but man takes the credit for deliverance. We now know that this strapped down, legs in stirrups position was the invention of French King Louis the 14th. I don't know, who mandated it throughout his kingdom because he was royally turned on by watching women in labor. With feminism and women's rediscovery of home birth, midwifery, and drug free delivery, this situation has in the past decade radically changed. As recently as 1971, midwifery and home birth were virtually illegal and or practically unobtainable in almost all American states. Now, women have heroically revived the occupation of midwife, established comfortable birthing centers, and forced hospitals to compete by offering women more comfort and autonomy in hospital delivery wards. Though midwifery and home birth have been common practices in 20th century Western Europe, the American medical profession fought them vigorously, perhaps accounting for the fact that America in the recent past ranked 17th in newborn mortality rates among the Western nations. American women's successful fight so far to rebirth childbirth to mother and child is reversing this statistic and also helping to re-empower women on the most basic level of becoming acquainted with our own bodies. One giant step for womankind. During the time of Catholic-dominated Europe, it was also a crime against God to miscarry. Even if a woman miscarried after an accident or after being beaten by her husband, she could still be put to death for her sin against the father, because all miscarriages were suspected by the clergy of being intentional abortions. The celibate clergy always tended to believe women were guilty until proven dead. When Spanish Catholics colonized the American West, forcibly missionizing the Western tribes, it was the custom for Native American women who miscarried for any reason to be punished by being whipped and publicly humiliated for their sin before the church door. It was believed, sometimes correctly, that Indian women would practice abortion in order to rob the church of Indian slave labor, and the priest of God could not allow this. The same mentality was practiced against European women for centuries by the Father Church. Wherever male religious and political systems are based on the control of women's reproduction, women must live like this. According to the Bible, rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, Samuel 15:23. All those who follow the ancient and original religion, refusing to be dominated and dichotomized by Father God ideology, are defined as evil rebels belonging to the devil and are to be put to death according to God's will. In the Bible, for the first time, we see God's will, or the male primate will, to control female reproduction used as a political tool to crush believers of other religions. Women's religions. The fanatic misogyny of both Christianity and Islam originated, as did both these religions, in the Bible. Or, as women of the women's movement of the 1970s said, you are a witch by being female, untamed, angry, joyous, and immortal. The Wiccan nature or witchcraft is the original nature of all women, deriving from our primary biological experience, our psychic relationship with the earth and cosmos. It is this experience, this relationship, that patriarchy sets out to destroy. But women cannot change our nature. We can only try to forget it, repress it, or follow it under constant threat of punishment by the dominating male order. About a modern day African witch, it is said, if she is lucky enough that her psychic powers are quiescent, then she can live a normal life. There is a constant fear among her husband's relatives that she will use her powers to revenge her humiliating situation as wife, isolated as she is among hostile strangers in the patriarchal land, in the patriarchal family, removed by patrilocal custom from her own maternal kin group. With quiescent, whatever, psychic powers, of course, any woman's normal life is one of submission. In parts of the west coast of Africa, tribes remained matriarchal until well into the 10th century. When forced into patriarchal organization from the outside through Islamic invasion, many African women chose to run away with Muslim slave traders rather than become wives. So, the witch alive under patriarchy is always under suspicion for having caused the sterility of her husband, or death, disease, and bad luck among her in-laws, or bad weather or bad crops. Or in more fundamentalist situations, she is always under suspicion as a willful seductress of good men, a tool of evil nature, or the devil designed by death and darkness to undermine and destroy what men call their civilization. Her genuine range and depth of creative powers are denied or forbidden. She lives in a man-made situation where she can use only her negative powers, and for what she is punished and damned. Patriarchy sets her up as the universal scapegoat for all problems, imagined or real, thus removing from all men in her vicinity the terrible burden of thought. During the 500 years of Inquisition, representing the triumph of Christian imperialism over pagan Europe, a woman could either become a totally subservient wife, beaten and bullied by her husband, her eyes to the ground as the priests and preachers condemned and blamed her sex for all things, or she could stand straight, proud in her own woman wisdom, and be burnt as a witch. And that is it for the night. Thanks again for listening. Tune in tomorrow for the Goddess of the Witches. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Shalom. Peace. Good night.